The sun died violently over the jagged spine of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, bleeding streaks of bruised purple and arterial crimson across the vast New Mexico sky. It was late August of the year 1874, and the heat did not simply rise from the earth. It radiated with a physical weight, pressing down on the canvas covers of the 12 wagons snake-crawling through the dust. The wind here was different from the polite breezes of Missouri. This wind had teeth. It carried the scent of dry sagebrush, the bitter tang of horse sweat, and the underlying, coppery taste of fear. Cora Lane sat on the hard wooden bench of the third wagon, her spine stiff against the jolting rhythm of the iron-rimmed wheels grinding over gravel. She was 22 years old, though the dust coating her pale skin made her look older, etching fine lines around her eyes and mouth. She held a leather-bound volume of poetry in her lap, her fingers gripping it so tightly that her knuckles were white. It was a foolish thing to bring into the wilderness, perhaps, but along with a small satchel of clothes and $30 pinned inside her corset, it was all she had. She was not supposed to be here. By rights, according to the laws of polite society and her father's ledger, she should be standing in a parlor in St. Louis, wearing silk, pouring tea for a man 3 times her age who smelled of tobacco and entitlement, a man who had bought her as surely as one bought a broodmare. But Cora had run. She looked out at the horizon, where the land stretched out endlessly, indifferent to human suffering. It was terrifying. It was magnificent. For the first time in her life, she belonged to no one. The vastness of the territory made her feel small, insignificant, and, paradoxically, entirely free. "Rough country, Miss Lane," a voice boomed from beside the wagon, interrupting her thoughts. Cora turned to see Briggs Dalton riding alongside. He was a large man, past 40, with a chest like a barrel and a face that had seen too much sun and perhaps too much whiskey, though he hid it well behind a veneer of gentlemanly conduct. He wore a fine frock coat that was perpetually dusty, and he sat on his horse with the arrogance of a former cavalry officer. "It is different from home. Mr. Dalton," Cora replied, her voice steady despite the dry scratch in her throat. "It is savage," Dalton corrected, his eyes sweeping the landscape not with wonder, but with calculation. He looked at the red earth and saw plots, deeds, and railway easements. "But that is why we are here. Is it not to bring order? To tame it? The railroad is coming. Miss Lane, within 5 years, this dirt will be worth more than gold. Civilization is marching west, and we are the vanguard." Cora nodded politely, though a cold shiver ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Briggs Dalton had positioned himself as the benefactor of this caravan, the man with the connections and the vision. He spoke of building a town in a valley called Coyote Springs, a place rumored to have water that never ran dry, sweet grass for grazing, and a strategic position for the future rail line. He made it sound like paradise, but there was something in the way he looked at the horizon like a butcher sizing up a carcass that unsettled her. And there was something in the way he looked at her, under the guise of protecting the weaker sex, that reminded her dangerously of the cage she had just escaped. "We will make camp soon," Dalton said, touching the brim of his hat. "I will ensure the men set your tent on flat ground tonight. You look weary." "I can manage. Thank you," Cora said. "Nonsense. It is my duty to see to the comfort of the ladies." He smiled, a tightening of lips that did not reach his eyes, and spurred his horse forward to bark orders at the lead driver. Cora watched him go, then shifted her gaze to the far front of the caravan. Riding point, nearly 50 yards ahead of the lead wagon, was a solitary figure on a paint horse. Tahan. He was the reason the caravan had not yet lost its way in the labyrinth of canyons. He was the reason half the travelers slept with pistols under their pillows. He was an Apache, a hired gun, a tracker. Even from this distance, his posture was distinct. He did not ride with the rigid, bouncing cadence of the white men. He moved with the animal, fluid and loose. He wore a faded calico shirt and buckskin trousers, his black hair held back by a simple strip of cloth. The settlers whispered about him. They said he had been a scout for the army, a man who hunted his own kind for government coin. They said he was a traitor to his blood and a danger to theirs. Dalton called him a necessary tool, speaking of him as one might speak of a heavy shovel or a sharp knife, useful, but dirty. Cora had never spoken to him, but she had watched him. She had seen the way he scanned the ridge lines, his head turning slowly, missing nothing. She had seen the long, jagged scar that ran down his left shoulder, visible through the tear in his shirt. And she had seen his eyes once, when he had ridden back to check the rear guard. They were dark, endless, and filled with a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the noise of the wagons. He was a man caught between tides, she thought, just like her. The sun dipped below the rim of the earth, and the sky turned a bruised violet. The order came down the line to circle the wagons. The caravan ground to a halt near a dry wash, the oxen groaning as the yokes were lifted. The camp sprang into life with practiced chaos. Men shouted, horses nickered, and the smell of wood smoke began to drift through the cooling air. Cora climbed down from her seat, her legs numb. She smoothed her gray skirt, conscious of the dust that seemed to have worked its way into the very weave of the fabric. She busied herself gathering dried mesquite wood for the fire. It was a humble task, but it gave her a reason to move. To be away from the prying questions of the other women who wanted to know why a girl of her breeding was traveling alone to the edge of the map. She walked toward the edge of the camplight, where the shadows stretched long and thin. The desert at night was a different creature. The cicadas began their rhythmic droning, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped, a lonely, sharp sound that pierced the twilight. Tahan was there, tending to his horse apart from the main remuda. He was wiping the animal down with a handful of dry grass, speaking low words in a language that sounded like water flowing over stones. Cora hesitated. She should go back. Dalton had warned them all not to wander, and certainly not to approach the Indian. But curiosity, her old vice, held her feet still. Tahan paused, his hand resting on the horse's flank. He did not turn around, yet Cora knew he was aware of her presence. "The wind is changing," he said. His English was clear, accented but devoid of the broken pigeon the dime novels attributed to his people. His voice was a deep rumble, vibrating in the quiet air. Cora started, nearly dropping her armful of wood. I beg your pardon." Tahan turned then. Up close. He was imposing. He was not overly tall, but he was built of lean muscle and wire. His face was angular, composed of sharp planes and copper skin, his eyes obscured by the shadow of the dusk. "The wind," he repeated, nodding toward the north. "It carries the smell of rain, but the sky is clear. A storm is coming, but not tonight." Cora looked up at the first few stars blinking into existence. "Mr. Dalton says we are having a good time. He says we will reach the valley in 4 days." Tahan's expression did not change, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Dalton sees what he wants to see. He looks at a map and thinks the land obeys the ink. "And what do you see?" Cora asked, surprised by her own boldness. Tahan looked past her, toward the darkening silhouette of the mountains. "I see rocks that shift. I see water that hides. This land does not like strangers." There was a sorrow in his tone that caught Cora off guard. It was not anger, not the savage fury Dalton warned of. It was a deep, resonant mourning. "You speak as if it is alive," she said softly. "It is," Tahan replied. "It remembers." At that moment, Briggs Dalton's voice boomed from the center of the camp. "Supper, get the fires hot." The sudden noise startled Cora. She flinched, and as she shifted her grip on the firewood, the small leather cord around her neck snagged on a protruding branch of mesquite she was holding. The knot, worn thin by years of wear, gave way. The silver chain slipped from her collar, and the heavy pendant plummeted. It hit a flat stone near Tahan's boot with a sharp clink. "Oh," Cora gasped, dropping the wood and falling to her knees. "My mother's—" She reached for it, her fingers trembling. It was the only thing she had left of the woman who had died when Cora was 6. A large, oval piece of turquoise, vibrant blue with a spiderweb of black matrix, set in tarnished silver, but a dark, calloused hand reached it first. Tahan crouched down, his movements blurringly fast. He picked up the pendant. Cora froze, expecting him to pocket it or inspect it with curiosity. Instead, Tahan went perfectly still. He held the stone in his palm, the silver setting catching the dying light. He did not look at the stone. He looked at the engraving on the back of the silver casing. It was a specific design, a stylized bird with spread wings, etched with a crude but distinctive hand. Cora watched his face. The mask of stoic indifference cracked. His eyes widened, just a fraction, and his breath hitched in his chest. He looked from the pendant to Cora's face, searching her features with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He looked at her pale blue eyes, the shape of her jaw, the way her hair curled at the temples. For a long moment, the world narrowed down to the space between them. The sounds of the camp faded, the shouting men, the crying babies, the crackle of fires, all of it receded. "Where did you get this?" Tahan asked. His voice was lower now, strained. "It was my mother's," Cora whispered, still on her knees in the dust. She wore it every day until she died. She said she brought it from the West, from before I was born." Tahan's thumb brushed over the turquoise. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He knew this stone. He knew the hands that had polished it. He knew the woman who had worn it, Laughing River. That was the name the band had given the white woman who had stumbled into their camp 25 years ago, half-starved and feverish. She had lived with them for 3 winters. She had learned their ways, learned to heal with roots and clay. She had been a sister to his own mother. And then, she had been taken back, dragged away by a husband who had finally tracked her down, a man who claimed to own her. Tahan looked at the young woman before him. The age was right. 22 years. The eyes were the same. She was the daughter of the woman who had walked between worlds. A dangerous secret lodged itself in Tahan's chest. If Dalton knew, if the soldiers knew that this proper white schoolteacher had a connection to the Apache, to the very people they were driving out, she would be ostracized. Or worse, she would be used. Cora reached out her hand, palm up. "Please, that is all I have." Tahan closed his fingers over the stone, warming the cold silver. He hesitated. He wanted to ask her 1,000 questions. He wanted to know if the woman had been happy in her cage back east. He wanted to know if she remembered the smell of sage and pine. But he saw Dalton approaching in his peripheral vision, striding toward them with purpose. Tahan placed the pendant into Cora's hand. His skin brushed hers, rough against soft, warm against cool. An electric shock, subtle but undeniable, passed between them. "Keep it hidden," Tahan said, his voice barely a whisper. "The silver is soft. It will break if you are not careful." He stood up abruptly, his face closing up like a shuttered window. By the time Briggs Dalton stepped into the circle of light, Tahan was merely the silent Indian guide once more, turning back to his horse. "Miss Lane," Dalton said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Is this man bothering you?" Cora clutched the pendant to her chest, her heart racing. She looked up at Tahan's broad back, then at Dalton's suspicious glare. "No," Cora said, standing up and dusting off her skirt. "No, Mr. Dalton, I dropped my firewood. He merely watched." Dalton sneered at Tahan's back. "That is all they do. Watch and wait. Come away from the edge of camp. Miss Lane, it is not safe." Dalton placed a heavy hand on Cora's shoulder to guide her back. Cora flinched instinctively at the touch, a reflex born of years avoiding her father's heavy-handed discipline and her fiancé's possessive grip. She stepped away, creating a polite distance. "I am quite capable of walking, sir," she said, as she walked back toward the safety of the firelight. Cora felt the weight of the turquoise against her skin. It feels heavier now, hotter. She glanced back over her shoulder. Tahan was watching her. The look in his eyes had changed. It was no longer the indifferent gaze of a paid guide. It was the look of a man who had found a ghost in the desert. Later that night, the camp settled into an uneasy slumber. The moon rose, painting the desert in shades of bone and ink. Cora lay in her small tent, unable to sleep. She held the pendant up to the moonlight filtering through the canvas. Why had he looked at it like that? Why had he told her to hide it? She thought of Missouri, of the stifling heat of the schoolhouse, of the suffocating weight of the wedding dress she had left lying on her bed, a pile of white lace that looked like a shroud. She had run west to find a place where she could breathe. She had thought the danger would be rattlesnakes, or hunger, or the sheer loneliness of the plains. She had not expected to find a mystery, and she certainly had not expected to feel safer standing next to a savage Apache warrior than she did next to the civilized men who claimed to protect her. Outside, by the embers of the scouts' fire, Tahan sat with his back against a wagon wheel. He was whittling a piece of cedar, the shavings curling onto the ground. His mind was not on the wood. It was in the past. He remembered the day the soldiers had come for his family. He remembered the long walk to the reservation, the sickness, the hunger. He remembered the promises made by men in blue coats, promises as empty as the dry riverbeds. And he remembered the white healer woman. She had told his mother once, "I leave my heart here, even if my body must go." Now, her daughter was here, heading straight for Coyote Springs. Tahan knew what waited at Coyote Springs. He knew why Dalton was so eager to reach it. He knew the survey markers were already being driven into the ground, cutting through the sacred places where his ancestors slept. The railroad wanted the water. The army wanted the Apache gone. Dalton wanted the money. And Cora Lane, with her books and her pale skin and her mother's stone, was walking blindly into the center of the war. Tahan tested the edge of his knife against his thumb. A thin line of blood appeared, dark and round. He had spent 5 years working for the army, telling himself it was the only way to survive, the only way to keep the remnants of his band from being slaughtered. He had guided the soldiers, translated their lies, and swallowed his pride until it tasted like ash in his mouth. He had become a man of no tribe, trusted by neither side. But looking at the girl today, seeing the turquoise that belonged to the old days, something in him had shifted, a crack in the stone. Briggs Dalton walked past the edge of the perimeter, checking the guards. He stopped near Tahan, lighting a cigar. The smoke drifted over, thick and pungent. "We cross the river tomorrow. Chief," Dalton said mockingly, "make sure you find a shallow ford. I do not want to lose any inventory." "The river is low," Tahan said, not looking up. "Good. Once we get to the springs, your job is done. I will have no further use for a scout." Dalton laughed softly. "Maybe I will let you stay on and dig ditches, if you can learn to use a shovel instead of a scalping knife." Dalton walked away, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel. Tahan wiped the blood from his thumb onto his trousers. He looked toward Cora's tent, a pale triangle in the darkness. "No," Tahan whispered to the night air. "My job is not done." The wind picked up, howling through the canyons like a grieving woman. It rattled the canvas of the wagons and kicked up dust that danced in the firelight. Cora turned over on her cot, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. She closed her eyes. But sleep was a distant country. She could feel the vibration of the earth beneath her, a low hum of energy. She was running toward freedom, she told herself. But as the wind rocked the wagon gently, she had the distinct, unsettling sensation that she was not running away from her fate, but sprinting headlong into it. And the silent man with the scar on his shoulder was the only one who saw the storm coming. The desert waited. The coyotes sang, and the first threads of a web that would bind a schoolteacher and a warrior together began to tighten in the dark. The caravan made camp along the banks of the Dry Bone River, a name that struck Cora as morbidly appropriate. There was no water in the riverbed, only a serpentine scar of cracked mud and bleached stones that wound its way through the sagebrush. They had to dig deep into the sand to find moisture for the horses, a task that left the men grumbling and the animals restless. Despite the desolation, a festive mood had overtaken the settlers. They were 2 days from Coyote Springs, and the promise of fresh water and free land had made them giddy. A fiddle was brought out, and its screeching, cheerful tune battled against the vast silence of the desert. A large bonfire crackled in the center of the circled wagons, sending sparks spiraling up toward the Milky Way. Cora Lane did not join the dancing. She sat on the steps of her wagon, mending a tear in her skirt, but her eyes kept drifting beyond the ring of light. Out there, in the shadows where the firelight died, stood Tahan. He did not lean against a wagon or sit on a crate. He stood perfectly still, his arms crossed over his chest, looking not at the fire, but at the sky. He was a silhouette cut from darkness, isolated by an invisible wall of prejudice and fear. The settlers laughed and drank whiskey within the circle, but their safety depended entirely on the man they refused to invite to their table. Thirst drove Cora to her feet. The water barrel was located near the front of the line, uncomfortably close to where Tahan was keeping his vigil. She filled her tin cup, the tepid water tasting faintly of oak and stagnation. As she turned to leave, Tahan shifted. He did not look at her, but his voice carried clearly over the distant sound of the fiddle. "The air is too heavy," he said. Cora paused, clutching her cup. "It is a warm night." "No," Tahan said, finally turning his head. The firelight caught the sharp angle of his cheekbone. "It is still, too still. The coyotes have stopped singing. The wind has died." He gestured toward the northwest with his chin. "A storm is building. Not rain, sand. We should move the wagons closer. Tie the canvas down tight." Cora looked at the sky. To her untrained eye, it looked clear, though the stars seemed to be shivering behind a high, thin mist. "You should tell Mr. Dalton," she suggested. "I told him," Tahan said, his tone flat. "He said I was trying to frighten the women." "Well, he is doing a fine job of ignoring good advice then," Cora said, a spark of indignation rising in her chest. "Miss Lane." The booming voice of Briggs Dalton shattered the moment. He approached them, a half-empty bottle of whiskey swinging in his hand, his face flushed with drink and firelight. He placed a possessive hand on the side of the wagon nearest Cora, boxing her in slightly. "I thought I told you to stay within the circle," Dalton said, his eyes sliding disdainfully over Tahan before settling on Cora with a smile that was meant to be charming but felt predatory. "You should not be out here listening to ghost stories from the help." He was not telling ghost stories. "Mr. Dalton," Cora said, stepping back to create space. "He believes a sandstorm is coming." Dalton laughed, a wet, dismissive sound. "Look at the stars. My dear, it is a beautiful night. This savage is just trying to make himself seem useful, so we do not leave him behind at the next outpost. Do not let him spook you." He turned to Tahan, his smile vanishing. "Get back to your post. If I see you bothering the lady again, you will not get your pay." Tahan did not flinch. He did not blink. He simply looked at Dalton with an expression of such utter neutrality that it was more insulting than a sneer. He turned and walked into the darkness without a word. "Primitive," Dalton muttered, taking a swig from his bottle. "Come, Cora. Let us get you back to the fire. It is safer." Cora allowed herself to be escorted back, but the feeling of unease had settled deep in her stomach. Tahan was not a man who wasted words. If he said the wind was wrong, she believed him. The attack came 3 hours after midnight. It did not begin with the stealth Cora had expected from the stories of Apache raids. It began with noise. Gunshots cracked through the air, loud and jarring, followed immediately by the screaming of horses and the shattering of wood. Cora was thrown from her cot as her wagon jolted violently. Someone was outside, shouting, "Indians, we are under attack, defend the wagons!" Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She scrambled to the floor, grabbing the small derringer she kept in her bag, a useless toy of a weapon, but it was all she had. She crawled to the front of the wagon, peering through the gap in the canvas flaps. The camp was a scene from hell. Men were running in their nightshirts, firing wildly into the dark. Figures on horseback tore through the gaps between the wagons, whooping and shrieking. They carried torches, and the firelight threw grotesque, dancing shadows against the canvas walls. Cora watched, terrified, as a rider galloped past her wagon. He was bare-chested, his face painted with black and red streaks, feathers tied into his hair. He raised a rifle and fired into the air, but as he passed, the torchlight from a fallen wagon illuminated him clearly for a single second. Cora froze. The man was shouting war cries, but in the middle of a scream, his horse stumbled. The rider yanked the reins and shouted, "Hold up, damn you!" The words were English. They were not just English. They were the coarse, guttural slang of the Missouri River docks. Cora pressed her face closer to the canvas gap, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard it hurt. She watched another attacker circle back. This one wore buckskin leggings, but on his upper body, flapping open in the wind, was a faded blue jacket with brass buttons, an army tunic. It was stained and torn, but an unmistakably military issue. And then the smell hit her. It was not the smell of sage or unwashed bodies. As the rider wheeled his horse near her hiding spot, the wind carried a pungent, sickly sweet odor. Cheap whiskey. The same whiskey the guards had been drinking earlier that evening. Realization washed over her like ice water. These were not Apache warriors defending their land. These were white men playing dress-up. They were drunk, they were armed with Army-issue repeating rifles, and they were putting on a show. "Help over here, they got Miller!" a voice screamed. The chaos lasted perhaps 20 minutes. Just enough time to terrify everyone, wound a few draft animals, and leave a young guard bleeding in the dirt with an arrow, a crudely made thing sticking out of his shoulder. Then, as quickly as they had come, the riders vanished into the night, leaving behind the smell of gunpowder and fear. Cora stayed hidden, clutching her derringer, her mind racing. Why would they do this? Then she heard Briggs Dalton's voice rising above the sobbing of the women and the groans of the wounded. "I told you," Dalton bellowed. "I told you we could not trust the land, it is infested with them." Morning brought a gray, sullen light to the camp. The storm Tahan had predicted had not yet hit, but the sky was the color of a bruise, heavy and suffocating. The camp was in an uproar. The settlers were exhausted, angry, and terrified. They needed someone to blame. They needed a target for their fear, and Briggs Dalton gave them one. Cora stepped out of her wagon to see a crowd gathering near the supply cart. In the center of the mob, 2 burly teamsters were holding Tahan. His hands were tied behind his back with thick hemp rope. His face was bruised, a cut bleeding sluggishly over his left eye. But he stood tall, refusing to struggle. "We found it in his bedroll," Dalton shouted, holding up a rifle. It was a Winchester, its stock scratched. One of the guns was stolen from the supply crate last week. And look at this. Dalton reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of cartridges. Army issue. The same shells we found scattered where the savages rode in. He signaled them. He marked us for his brothers to slaughter. "Liar," Tahan said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "I have no brothers who would ride like drunkards and shoot at the moon." "Silence him," a woman shrieked. "He tried to kill my baby." One of the teamsters struck Tahan in the stomach. He doubled over, gasping for air, but the men hauled him back up. Cora stood on the periphery, her hands shaking. She looked at the rifle in Dalton's hand. She had seen that rifle before. It belonged to one of Dalton's own hired hands, a man named Silas with a missing tooth. She had seen Silas cleaning it 2 days ago. It was a setup. A clumsy, brutal frame-up designed to turn the fear of the settlers into hatred, to justify whatever war Dalton wanted to start in the valley. "We should hang him," a man shouted. "String him up right here." "No," Dalton said, raising a hand with a mock benevolence. "We are civilized men. We are not savages like him. We will take him to Fort Union. He was an Army scout. Let the Army hang him for treason." Lieutenant, a young Army officer, Lieutenant Evans, stepped forward. He looked pale and sick. "Mr. Dalton, perhaps we should investigate first. He has been a faithful guide for 500 miles. "Faithful," Dalton sneered. "Look at the arrow in poor Miller's shoulder. Lieutenant, do you want to be responsible for the massacre of these women and children because you were soft on a traitor? The lieutenant crumbled under the pressure. He looked at the angry mob, then at the stoic prisoner. Very well. Secure him to the rear of the supply wagon. We will transport him to the fort. Cora felt a wave of nausea. Taking him to the fort was a death sentence. Or worse. Dalton would ensure he never made it to the fort alive. A failed escape attempt on the road was a common enough story. She looked at Tahan. His eyes met hers across the crowd. There was no pleading with them, only a resigned acceptance of a fate he had likely expected all his life. But beneath that resignation, Cora saw the flicker of the man who had held her mother's turquoise pendant with such reverence. He was innocent, and she was the only one who knew the full truth. If she spoke up now, Dalton would turn the mob on her. He would call her hysterical, or accuse her of sympathizing with the enemy. A woman's word against a wealthy landowner and a hysterical crowd was worth nothing. But if she did nothing, Tahan would die. The order was given to break camp. The men dispersed to hitch the oxen, their movements jerky with anger. The guards dragged Tahan toward the rear wagon, tying him to the large wooden wheel while they prepared the chains. Dalton walked past Cora, tipping his hat. Justice, Miss Lane, it is a harsh business, but necessary. Cora did not answer. She turned back to her wagon, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She went inside and grabbed the small paring knife she used for peeling apples. She hid it in the fold of her sleeve. She waited. The confusion of breaking camp was her cover. Dust rose in choking clouds as the wagons maneuvered into line. Men shouted at oxen, mothers scolded children. Dalton was at the front of the column, arguing with the lieutenant about the route. The two guards watching Tahan were distracted, sharing a flask of whiskey to calm their nerves after the night's excitement. They had tied Tahan to the wheel but had not yet shackled his feet. Cora took a breath that tasted of grit and terror. She walked toward the supply wagon. "Excuse me," she said to the guards, her voice trembling just enough to sound like a frightened schoolteacher. "Mister, Dalton asked me to fetch the medical box from the back for the wounded man." The guards looked at her, then at each other. They shrugged. "Make it quick. Miss, we are rolling in 5 minutes." They stepped aside, moving a few feet away to continue their drink. Cora moved behind the wagon. Tahan was slumped against the wheel, his wrists bound tight to the spokes. He looked up as she approached, his eyes narrowing. "Go away," he whispered roughly. "Do not let them see you near me." Cora dropped to her knees beside him. She did not look at his face. She looked at the thick hemp ropes cutting into his wrists. "I saw them," she whispered, her voice fierce and low. "I saw the blue coat. I smelled the whiskey. They were white men. Tahan." Tahan went still. "You saw?" "Yes." Cora pulled the knife from her sleeve. Her hands were shaking, but she forced them to be steady. She began to see the ropes. The blade was dull, and the rope was thick. "I know you did not do it." "Stop," Tahan hissed. "If they catch you, they will ruin you. Dalton will destroy you." "He will kill you," Cora retorted, swinging harder. A strand of rope snapped, then another. "I ran away from one life because I would not be owned. I will not stand by and watch murder done in the name of safety." "You are a fool," Tahan said, but there was awe in his voice. "Likely," Cora agreed. The final strand gave way. Tahan's hands were free. "Hey!" The shout came from behind them. One of the guards had turned around. "What are you doing back there?" Cora dropped the knife. Tahan moved with the speed of a striking snake. He did not run immediately. He grabbed Cora's arm, pulling her to her feet. "Run!" he commanded. "What?" "Run!" He shoved her toward the open desert, away from the wagons. At the same moment, he grabbed the heavy iron rim of the wagon wheel and heaved, rocking the vehicle just enough to create a distraction. The guard fumbled for his rifle. "Prisoner escapes! He is loose!" Chaos erupted again, but this time, Cora was in the center of it. She hiked up her skirts and ran. She ran toward the sagebrush, toward the dry riverbed, toward the only emptiness that offered shelter. She heard heavy footsteps behind her. Tahan was running, not away from her, but with her. He could have outpaced her easily, vanished into the terrain he knew so well, but he matched his stride to hers, placing himself between her and the camp. A gunshot cracked. Dirt exploded near Cora's foot. She screamed, stumbling. "Down!" Tahan roared. He launched himself at her, his arms sweeping around her waist. The impact knocked the wind out of her. They hit the edge of the steep bank of the dry wash and tumbled. The world became a blur of sky, earth, and pain. They rolled down the embankment, crashing through brittle brush and sliding over loose shale. Cora's head struck the sand at the bottom, and stars exploded behind her eyes. She lay there, gasping, her lungs burning. A heavy weight pressed her into the dirt. Tahan lay half over her, shielding her body with his own. He was breathing hard, a ragged sound in the quiet of the wash. Above them, on the ridge, voices shouted, "Where did they go? Down the wash, shoot anything that moves!" Another shot rang out, burying itself in the opposite bank of the ravine. Tahan pressed a hand over Cora's mouth, his eyes locking onto hers. They were wide, intense, and alive with a fierce, reckless energy. He shook his head slowly. Silence. They lay together in the dust, the scent of his sweat and the metallic tang of fear filling Cora's senses. She could feel his heart beating against her chest, a frantic, powerful rhythm that matched her own. She had done it. She had severed the last tie to the world she knew. She was no longer a schoolteacher, no longer a victim, no longer a respectable woman. In the eyes of the men above, she was now a traitor. Tahan shifted his weight, pulling back slightly to check the ridge. He looked down at her, seeing the terror in her eyes, but also the defiance. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man being hunted. "You should have stayed," he whispered, his voice rough with dust. "I couldn't," Cora whispered back, her throat raw. He nodded once, a solemn acknowledgement of a pact sealed in adrenaline and dust. "Then we go," he said. "The storm I promised, it is here." Above them, the sky finally darkened, not with night, but with the wall of sand Tahan had predicted hours ago. The wind began to howl, erasing their footprints, erasing the path back. They were alone in the wild, with an army behind them and nothing ahead but the unforgiving red earth. The sandstorm that had covered their escape died as quickly as it had been born, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt heavy on the ears. The world was stripped of color, reduced to shades of gray and silver under the rising moon. They had walked for hours, putting miles of broken ground between themselves and the caravan. Tahan had led them into a maze of slot canyons where the wind howled through the narrows, scrubbing away their tracks. Now, as the temperature plummeted with the setting sun, a treacherous shift typical of the high desert, they found shelter in a shallow depression beneath an overhang of sandstone. Cora Lane sat with her back against the cold rock, shivering violently. Her fine traveling dress was torn at the hem, and the dust of the territory was matted in her hair. She hugged her knees to her chest, watching the man who was now her only shield against the vast, indifferent night. Tahan moved with an economy of motion that fascinated and terrified her. He gathered dried sagebrush and deadwood, arranging them in a small, tight cone. He struck a match, one of the few he carried in a leather pouch, and nursed a flame into existence. But as soon as the fire caught, he began to pile stones around it, building a chimney that directed the light upward and shielded it from the sides. "Why do you hide it?" Cora asked, her voice sounding thin and brittle in the open air. "We need the warmth. The warmth will stay," Tahan said, his voice low. "But the light travels. In this land, a fire can be seen for 10 miles by eyes that know where to look. We want to be warm. Miss Lane, not found." He sat back on his heels, the firelight casting deep shadows across the planes of his face. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Cora felt a spike of fear. She had been raised on penny dreadfuls and newspaper headlines that painted men like him as monsters, savages who killed for sport. Yet this monster had thrown his body over hers to stop a bullet. "You are shaking," he observed, He unfastened the rough wool blanket he carried rolled across his chest and tossed it to her. "Take it. But you, I am used to the cold. Your blood is thin." Cora wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. It smelled of horse, wood smoke, and sage, a scent that was inextricably masculine and wild. "Thank you," she whispered. She watched him feed a small twig to the fire. "Why did they hate you so much?" she asked. "Before the attack, before Mr. Dalton framed you, you worked for them. You guided us." Tahan stared into the flames. For a long time, she thought he would not answer. He was a man who hoarded words like water in a drought. "I did not guide you," Tahan said finally. "I guided the army. 3 years ago." He touched the scar on his shoulder absently. "I was a scout. I wore the blue coat, just like the men who attacked the wagons tonight." "You fought for the army?" Cora asked, surprised. "I fought for my people," he corrected sharply. "The general told us that if we helped them map the canyons, if we helped them find the renegades who raided the settlements, then my band would be left alone. He promised us the Valley of Coyote Springs. He said it would be ours forever, written on paper with the seal of the Great Father in Washington." He picked up a handful of red dirt and let it sift through his fingers. "I believed him. I led them through the passes. I showed them where the water was hidden, and when the fighting was done, they took the maps I drew and gave them to the railroad men. They told my family to move to the reservation at Bosque Redondo, a place where the water is salty and the corn will not grow." Cora felt the bitterness in his voice, a heavy, jagged thing. "They lied to you. They lied," Tahan agreed. "And now, I am a traitor to the Apache because I helped the soldiers, and I am a savage to the soldiers because I am Apache. I belong nowhere." He looked up at her, his dark eyes piercing. "And you, Miss Lane, why does a woman like you run into the wasteland? You have soft hands. You do not belong here either." Cora looked down at her hands, stained now with the red earth. "I am running from a lie too. Tahan." She pulled the blanket tighter. "My father, he had debts. There was a man in Missouri, a merchant. He was wealthy, and he wanted a wife who could quote poetry and look pretty at dinner parties. He bought my father's debts, and in exchange, he expected me." She remembered the way the merchant had looked at her, not as a person, but as a prize heifer to be inspected. She remembered the bruising grip on her arm when she had tried to speak her mind, the cold whisper in her ear that he would break her spirit just as he broke his horses. "He told me that once we were married, I would never leave his house without his permission," Cora said, her voice trembling with the memory of that suffocating terror. "He said I was his property, just like his silver and his land. So I took what money I could find, and I ran. I would rather die of thirst in this desert than live in a velvet cage." Tahan studied her. The contempt he usually held for the white settlers softened, replaced by a grudging respect. He understood cages. He understood the desperation that made a person leap into the dark. "Then we are both ghosts," Tahan said quietly, "running from graves they dug for us." The next 2 days were a blur of exhaustion and harsh lessons. The desert was a cruel teacher, and Cora was a struggling student. They moved south, keeping to the high ridges where the ground was hard and left little trail. The sun was a hammer, beating down on them until Cora felt lightheaded. Her boots, made for walking on city cobblestones, were quickly scuffed and torn by the sharp shale. On the second afternoon, they had to cross a narrow scree slope to reach a hidden spring Tahan knew of. The path was barely a foot wide, with a sheer drop of 300 feet to the canyon floor below. Cora pressed her back against the rock wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I cannot do it," she whispered. "You must," Tahan said from ahead. He moved with the grace of a mountain goat, finding footing where there seemed to be none. "Look at the stone. Cora, do not look at the fall. The stone will hold you if you respect it." She took a step. The gravel shifted under her boot with a sickening hiss. She gasped, her foot sliding outward. "Easy." Tahan's voice was calm, anchoring her. He reached back, his hand extended. "Take my hand." Cora reached out. His fingers closed around her wrist, a grip of iron. He did not pull her. He steadied her. He let her find her own balance, lending her his strength only when she faltered. "Step there," he instructed, pointing to a gray slab of rock. "Yes, now the next." When they finally reached the solid ground of the plateau, Cora collapsed, her legs turning to jelly. She sat there, breathing hard, the adrenaline slowly draining away to leave her trembling. Tahan knelt beside her. He uncorked his canteen almost empty and offered it to her. "Drink, but slowly. Wet your tongue first." She took a small sip, the water warm and tasting of leather, but to her, it was sweeter than wine. She handed it back, but he shook his head. "Finish it. We are close to spring." As she drank, the turquoise pendant slipped out from beneath her torn collar, dangling in the sunlight. The blue stone seemed to glow against the dusty fabric of her dress. Tahan went still. He reached out, his hand hovering near the stone but not touching it. "You said this belonged to your mother," he said. His voice was tight. Cora nodded, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "Yes, she died when I was 6. My father never spoke of her, except to say she was a wild spirit. She disappeared for 3 years before I was born. When she came back to Missouri, she was sick, and she carried me. And this stone." Tahan looked at the intricate etching on the silver setting the bird with the spread wings. It was not a design from a jewelry store in St. Louis. It was the mark of the mountain spirit, carved by an old silversmith from his own band, a man who had died 10 years ago. "The woman who wore this," Tahan began, choosing his words with agonizing care. "She came to us in the winter of the deep snow. She was white, but her spirit was red. She learned to call the rain. She learned to mix the clay for the fever. We called her Laughing River, because her laugh was the only sound that could cut through the silence of hunger." Cora stared at him, her eyes widening. A memory, faint and dreamlike, surfaced a woman humming a melody that was not a hymn, a melody that sounded like the wind in the canyons. "My mother's name was Sarah," Cora whispered. "But she used to call me Little Bird in a language my father forbade her to speak." "Sidai," Tahan said. "It means bird." "Yes," Cora gasped, tears pricking her eyes. "That was the word. Sidai." Tahan sat back, the weight of the revelation settling on his shoulders. It was not a coincidence. The spirits did not deal in coincidences. This woman, this schoolteacher with the sunburned nose and the fierce will, was the daughter of Laughing River. She was the child of the woman who had saved his sister from the spotted sickness. "Your mother was a healer," Tahan said softly. "She saved many lives, including mine, when I was a boy and the fever took my legs. She sat by me for 3 nights, cooling my blood with water from the spring." He looked at Cora with new eyes. She was no longer just a burden or a responsibility. She was a link, a bridge to a past that had been stolen from him. "She was taken from us," Tahan said, his voice hardening. "A white man came with a tracker. He dragged her away. She screamed your name or the name of the child she carried. We tried to stop him, but the elders said we could not fight the white law." Cora covered her mouth with her hand. "My father, he always said he rescued her from savages. He said she was kidnapped." "She was not kidnapped," Tahan said firmly. "She was found, and then she was stolen back." A silence stretched between them, filled only by the wind. It was a heavy, sacred silence. Cora felt the ground shift beneath her feet again, not physically this time, but spiritually. Her history, her identity, was rewriting itself in the middle of the desert. "Why did you not tell me before?" she asked. "I was not sure," Tahan said, "and I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "That you would be the bridge," he said cryptically. "My mother, the wise one of our group, used to say that the blood of Laughing River would return one day, that it would be the thread that stitches the wound between our peoples." He looked at her, his eyes intense and vulnerable. "I did not want to believe it, because bridges are walked upon, Cora, and bridges are burned." It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it on his tongue was intimate, stripping away the formalities of their previous lives. Before Cora could answer, Tahan stood up abruptly. He turned his face to the wind. sniffing the air like a wolf. He shaded his eyes and looked toward the south. "Look," he pointed, far in the distance, against the azure sky. A column of black smoke rose lazily. It was thick and oily, the smoke of burning railroad ties or tar. "What is it?" Cora asked, standing beside him. "Signals," Tahan said grimly. "Briggs Dalton is not just hunting us. He is lighting fires to call the cavalry. He is claiming that the Apache are burning the homesteads." Cora gasped. "He is starting a war. To cover up his theft of the land? Yes. If the army comes in force, they will sweep the valley of Coyote Springs. My people are there now, camped for the harvest. They will be slaughtered." Tahan turned to her. The vulnerability was gone, replaced by the hard edge of the warrior. "I cannot run anymore," he said. "I have to stop him, but I cannot do it with a bow and arrow. I need proof. I need the papers that Dalton keeps in his office." "His office?" "In Las Piedras," Tahan said. "It is a town on the border, 20 miles from here. It is a place of thieves and lawyers. Dalton has an office there where he keeps the deeds to the land he steals." He looked at Cora. "I will take you to the edge of the town. There is a mission church. The priest is a good man. He will hide you until you can find a wagon back east." Cora looked at the smoke rising in the distance. She thought of her father, of the merchant in Missouri, of Briggs Dalton and his fake benevolence. She thought of her mother, who had learned to heal in the wild, and who had been dragged back to a cage. She reached up and touched the turquoise pendant. "No," Cora said. Tahan frowned. "No, I am not going to the church," she said, her voice steadying with a newfound resolve. "You cannot walk into a town like Las Piedras. They will shoot you on sight or hang you before you reach the door of the land office. You are a wanted man. Tahan, I have walked in the shadows before, not in a town of lawyers and deeds." Cora countered. "You cannot read their legal script. You do not know what to look for. But I do." She stepped closer to him. "I can read the contracts. I can find the proof of the forgery. I can walk into that office as a white woman looking to buy land, and no one will look twice at me." "It is too dangerous," Tahan said, shaking his head. "If Dalton's men catch you—" "If they catch you, you die," Cora said. "If they catch me, I am just a foolish woman who got lost. I have a better chance." She looked him in the eye. "My mother did not run from your people. She stayed. I am staying too." Tahan looked at her for a long moment. He saw the fear in her. Yes, but he also saw the iron. He saw the daughter of Laughing River. "You are reckless," he said, but the corner of his mouth twitched in something that might have been a smile. "I am learning," Cora replied. "Las Piedras is a snake pit," Tahan warned. "We will have to move at night. We will have to be ghosts." "Then teach me," Cora said. "Teach me to be a ghost." Tahan nodded slowly. He reached out and adjusted the blanket on her shoulder, his hand lingering for a heartbeat longer than necessary. "We leave at dusk," he said. "Rest now. Sidie. Tonight, we run toward the fire." As the sun began to lower, casting long purple shadows across the canyons, Cora sat watching the smoke on the horizon. She felt a strange sensation in her chest. It was the feeling of a lock clicking open. She was terrified, dusty, and hunted, but for the first time in 22 years, she was exactly where she chose to be. Las Piedras was not a town. It was a scar upon the earth. It rose out of the dust like a jagged set of teeth, a collection of timber and adobe structures that seemed to be held together by greed and dry rot. The main street was a river of churned mud and refuse, lined with saloons that smelled of stale beer and despair, and land offices that smelled of ink and lies. To Cora Lane, who had spent the last 3 days learning the silent, majestic language of the canyons, Las Piedras felt like a slap in the face. It was loud, chaotic, and suffocating. They had arrived at the outskirts just as the sun began to bleed into the western horizon. Tahan had pulled his hat low, obscuring his face, and wrapped a serape around his shoulders to hide his buckskins. In the dim light, he passed for a Mexican vaquero, provided no one looked too closely at the sharp, unmistakably Apache angles of his face. Civilization, Tahan murmured, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. He guided their tired horses toward the rear of a dilapidated stable near the edge of the Mexican quarter. It smells of money and unwashed bodies. It smells like danger, Cora corrected, dismounting. Her legs ached, and her dress was stained with the red dust of the trail. But she held her head high. She reached up to touch the hidden turquoise pendant beneath her bodice for courage. "We split here," Tahan said, his voice low. "Father Gabriel is at the Mission San Miguel, 3 streets over. He has ears in the darker corners of this town. He will know if the army is truly mobilizing." "And the land office is on Main Street, next to the bank," Cora said. "I saw the sign as we rode in." Tahan caught her arm as she turned to leave. His grip was firm, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "Be careful. Cora, in the desert, the rattlesnake warns you before it strikes. Here, the snakes wear suits and smile while they bite." "I will be the confused schoolteacher," she promised, forcing a smile she did not feel. Men like that never look past a woman's bonnet. The interior of the Territorial Land Office was stiflingly hot. A ceiling fan rotated lazily, stirring the fly-blown air but doing nothing to cool it. Behind a high oak counter sat a man who looked as though he had been carved from suet. He was sweating profusely, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal pale, hairy arms. "Help you, miss," he grunted, not bothering to look up from his newspaper. Cora adjusted her shawl, adopting the demeanor of a woman overwhelmed by the harshness of the frontier. "Oh, I certainly hope so, sir. I am somewhat lost in all this paperwork." The clerk looked up then, his eyes narrowing as he took in her dusty appearance. "We are closing in 10 minutes. Please," Cora said, allowing a tremor to enter her voice. "I am looking for a parcel of land. My fiancé, he mentioned a place called Coyote Springs. He said he purchased a deed there, but I have not heard from him in weeks. I fear he may have been swindled." The clerk let out a bark of laughter. "Coyote Springs, lady. That is Indian territory. Or it was, until the new railroad easements came through." "Exactly," Cora pressed, leaning against the counter. "He said the railroad was involved. Is there a registry, a ledger? I just need to see if his name is on the land, so I know whether to wait for him or return to Missouri." The clerk sighed, annoyed by her persistence, but clearly eager to get rid of her. He hauled a heavy, leather-bound ledger onto the counter and flipped it open with a wet thumb. "County records. Sector 4, he muttered. He turned the pages aggressively. "Coyote Springs. Coyote Springs. Here. See, most of that valley was claimed 6 months ago." Cora's heart hammered against her ribs. She leaned over the book, her eyes scanning the handwritten entries. She saw the name Briggs Dalton immediately, but it was not listed as a direct purchase. It was listed as a transfer. Transfer of deed from Hector Villalobos to the Dalton Southern Pacific Consortium. Consideration $100. Cora frowned. She ran her finger down the list. Transfer from Maria Gonzalez. Consideration $50. Transfer from Antonio Perez. Consideration $75. "Who are these people?" Cora asked softly. "Villalobos Gonzalez. Squatters." The clerk sniffed. "Mexicans who claimed they had old Spanish grants. Mr. Dalton was generous enough to buy them out to clear the title for the rail line." Cora stared at the signatures. They were shaky, barely legible marks. And then she saw something that made her blood run cold. The signature for Antonio Perez was dated September the 4th. "Sir," Cora said, her voice dropping. "Today is August the 29th. The clerk froze. He looked at the book, then at Cora. A flicker of suspicion ignited in his watery eyes. He slammed the ledger shut. "Clerical error," he snapped. "We have a lot of paperwork. Now, unless you see your fiancé's name, you need to leave." "Wait," Cora said, desperation sharpening her tone. "There was a note in the margin." "Something about military security zone?" "That is none of your concern," the clerk said, his voice dangerous now. He stood up, towering over the counter. "Who are you, really?" Cora backed away. She had seen enough. The sellers were likely dead or fictional. The dates were forged to predate the upcoming Army survey. Dalton was creating a paper trail to legalize a theft that hadn't even happened yet, using the Army to clear out the Apache under the guise of protecting legal land claims. I must have the wrong office," Cora stammered. She turned and fled the room, the bell above the door jingling frantically. She stepped out onto the boardwalk, her lungs gasping for the dusty air. She had to find Tahan. They had the proof, or at least the knowledge of it. "Hey, you!" The voice came from the saloon porch across the street. Cora froze. Standing there, leaning against a post, was a man with a missing tooth and a dirty bowler hat. It was Silas, one of the teamsters from the wagon train, one of Dalton's hired guns. Silas squinted at her. Then his eyes went wide. "That is the schoolteacher, the one who cut the Indian loose." Cora did not wait. She gathered her skirts and ran. "Stop her!" Silas shouted, jumping off the porch. $500 to the man who stops that girl." Cora bolted down the alleyway between the bank and the general store. Mud splattered her hem. She could hear heavy boots pounding on the wooden planks behind her. She turned a corner, knocking over a stack of empty crates, and sprinted toward the Mexican quarter. The sky above was turning a bruised, angry purple. The wind was picking up, whipping dust into blinding spirals. A storm was coming, a real one this time. She reached the stable just as the first heavy drops of rain began to crater the dust. Tahan was there, hitching 2 fresh horses to a small, covered buckboard wagon he had procured. "Tahan!" she screamed. He looked up, saw her panic, and saw the 2 men rounding the corner behind her. In one fluid motion, he vaulted into the driver's seat. "Get in!" he roared. Cora threw herself into the back of the wagon just as a gunshot cracked the air. A splinter of wood from the tailgate flew past her cheek. Tahan snapped the reins, and the horses surged forward, bursting out of the stable and into the labyrinth of back streets. They drove hard for an hour, pushing the horses until their flanks were foamy with sweat. They left Las Piedras behind, but they could not outrun the sky. The storm that broke over the high desert was violent and absolute. It was not merely rain, it was a deluge. Thunder shook the ground, rattling the very bones of the earth. Lightning tore the sky into jagged ribbons of blinding white. "We cannot cross the wash," Tahan shouted over the roar of the wind. "The flash flood will hit any minute." He pulled the horses hard to the left, guiding the wagon toward a shallow cave formed by a massive overhang of sandstone at the base of a cliff. He drove the wagon deep into the shelter of the rock, the wheels grinding over stone. "Get in the back," Tahan commanded, tying the reins quickly. He scrambled over the seat and into the bed of the wagon with Cora. He pulled the heavy canvas flaps shut and lashed them tight, sealing them inside a small, dim cocoon of wood and cloth. Outside, the world ended. Hailstones the size of musket balls began to hammer the roof of the wagon, a deafening drum roll that drowned out all thought. The wind howled like a wounded beast, rocking the wagon on its springs. Cora was huddled in the corner, shivering uncontrollably. The adrenaline of the escape had crashed, leaving her cold and terrified. "Cora!" Tahan's voice was close. In the gloom, he found her. He did not ask permission. There was no time for propriety. He pulled her away from the cold wooden side of the wagon and drew her into the center, onto the pile of blankets and straw. "You are freezing," he murmured. He sat with his back against a crate, pulling her against his chest. He wrapped his heavy wool serape around both of them, creating a tent within a tent. Cora gasped at the contact. He was warm, burning hot. Actually, she could feel the hard planes of his chest against her back, the steady, powerful thrum of his heart. She could smell him rain, leather, horses, and the distinct, smoky scent of pine pitch. "They saw me," Cora whispered, her teeth chattering. "Silas saw me. They know we know." "It does not matter now," Tahan said, his arms tightening around her. "Let the storm pass. We are safe here." "I saw the ledger," she hurried to say, needing to spill the poison of the town. "Dalton forged the deeds. He used names of dead men. He dated them for September. He owns nothing. Tahan, it is all a lie. Shh, Tahan soothed, resting his chin on the top of her head. You did well. Sidai, you did what no warrior could do. The wagon lurched violently as a gust of wind slammed into the side. Cora cried out, burying her face in his neck. It is just the wind, Tahan whispered, his hand coming up to stroke her hair, untangling the knots the wind had made. Just the wind. His hand brushed her cheek. Her skin was cold, clammy with rain and fear. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. Cora turned in his arms, shifting so she could look at him. In the flashes of lightning that illuminated the canvas roof, she saw his face. The stoicism was gone. In its place was a raw, naked hunger that mirrored her own. You were right, she whispered. About my mother. Tahan looked at the turquoise pendant resting at the hollow of her throat. I spoke to the priest. He remembers her. He said she came to him years ago, weeping, asking God to forgive her for leaving her heart in the desert. He looked into Cora's eyes. She did not want to leave. Cora, she loved the land. And she loved the life she found here. And you? Cora asked, her voice barely audible over the drumming of the hail. What do you love? Tahan. Tahan looked at her mouth. The question hung in the small, warm space between them. I have spent 10 years learning to love nothing, he said hoarsely, because everything I love is taken by the soldiers or the sickness. He raised his hand, his rough, calloused fingers cupping her face. But the spirits are cruel. They bring you to me, a woman I cannot save and cannot keep. I do not need saving, Cora said, a sudden fierce heat rising in her blood. She leaned into his touch. And I am not asking to be kept, I am asking to be held. The wagon rocked again, swaying on its suspension like a ship at sea. The storm outside was chaotic, but inside, the air was thick with a different kind of electricity. Tahan let out a low groan, a sound of surrender. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. It was not the polite, dry peck of the suitors in Missouri. It was slow, deep, and devastating. It tasted of salt and desperation. It was the collision of two worlds that had been spinning toward each other for a lifetime. Cora moaned, a soft sound that was lost in the thunder. She opened to him, her hands clutching the lapels of his buckskin shirt, pulling him closer. She felt the ridge of the scar on his shoulder beneath the leather, a map of his pain. She wanted to heal it. She wanted to trace every line of his history with her own. He drew her closer, until there was no space left between them. The wagon creaked and swayed, rocking with the rhythm of the wind and the shift of their bodies. Slowly, he whispered against her lips, though his heart was hammering against hers like a war drum. I want to remember this. He kissed the hollow of her throat, the pulse point that fluttered like a trapped bird. He kissed the dust from her forehead. He held her with a reckless devotion, as if his sheer will could protect her from the army, from Dalton, from the entire encroaching world. For Cora, it was a terrifying unraveling. She had spent her life building walls of propriety and books. Tahan walked through them as if they were smoke. He did not own her. He inhabited her. The storm raged for hours. The wagon rocked in the darkness, a tiny arc of warmth in a freezing ocean of night. They did not sleep. They held each other, exchanging breath, exchanging heat, anchoring each other to the earth while the sky tried to tear it apart. When the sun finally rose, it brought a silence so pure it felt holy. The air was crisp and smelled of wet sage and ozone. The light that filtered through the canvas was pale and gold. Cora woke first. She was lying with her head on Tahan's chest. His arm was still around her, heavy and protective. She listened to the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. She did not feel ashamed. That was a surprise. According to everything she had been taught in Sunday school, she should feel fallen, ruined, but she felt new. She sat up slowly, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. Tahan opened his eyes instantly. There was no moment of disorientation. He was awake and alert in a second. He looked at her, and a softness entered his dark eyes that made Cora's chest ache. "The storm has passed," he said quietly. "The one outside has—" Cora replied. They sat up, straightening their clothes in the awkward, tender silence of the morning after. The intimacy of the night hung around them, a tangible thing. Tahan pushed open the canvas flaps. The world outside was washed clean. The red rocks glistened. The air was cool. "We cannot go back to the caravan," Tahan said, jumping down from the wagon and offering his hand to help her down. "And we cannot go back to Las Piedras." Cora took his hand. His grip was warm, familiar now. "We have to go to the army," she said. Tahan stiffened. "The army is the enemy. Cora, they are the ones helping Dalton." "Not all of them," Cora argued, her mind working sharply now, fueled by the clarity of the morning. "The lieutenant, Evans, he hesitated when Dalton demanded your arrest. He looked sick when they beat you. He is young, Tahan. He is not corrupt. He is just weak, and he is afraid. A weak man with a gun is more dangerous than a strong one," Tahan said. "But a weak man with a conscience can be turned," Cora insisted. "We have the truth now. We know the deeds are forged. If we can get to Colonel Mackenzie at Fort Union, a man known for his strict honor, or if we can get Lieutenant Evans to see the proof." "We have no proof," Tahan reminded her. "Only what you saw in a book that is now locked away." "We have my testimony," Cora said. "I am a white woman, the daughter of a respected family, at least they think I am. And I have you. You are the witness to the land itself." She stepped closer to him, placing her hand on his chest. "We stop running, Tahan. We go to Coyote Springs. We meet Dalton there, and we make our stand before the first spike is driven." Tahan looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, the set of her jaw. She was no longer the frightened girl reading poetry in a wagon. She was a woman who had weathered the storm. "It is a trap," Tahan said. "If we go there, we are walking into the kill zone." "Then we change the ground," Cora said. "You know the valley. You know every rock and cave. You said the land remembers. Let us make it remember us." Tahan took a deep breath, looking toward the distant mountains where his ancestors slept. He looked back at Cora, the woman who carried his mother's stone and his own heart. "Reckless," he murmured again, but this time with a smile. "Very well. We will go to Coyote Springs." He lifted her onto the wagon seat. As he climbed up beside her, he paused. "Cora." "Yes, my mother said the daughter of two worlds would be a bridge," he said, taking the reins. "I thought a bridge was something passive. Some people walked over." He looked at her with intense pride. "I was wrong. A bridge is the only thing that can span the abyss." He snapped the reins. "Hya!" The wagon lurched forward, wheels splashing through the puddles of the night's rain, heading west toward the rising sun and the final battle for the valley. The valley of Coyote Springs was a wound of green in the red flesh of the desert. Cottonwood trees, ancient and twisted with age, clustered around the natural cisterns where water bubbled up from the deep earth, cold and sweet. It was a place that felt held apart from time, a sanctuary that breathed a different air than the scorching plains surrounding it. But today, the air tasted of dust and anxiety. Tahan slowed the buckboard wagon as they crested the final ridge. Below them, tucked into the shadows of the canyon walls, the Apache band was breaking camp. It was a scene of frantic, fearful movement. Women were rolling hides, men were extinguishing fires, and children were being hurried onto ponies. They knew what was coming. The smoke signals Tahan had seen days ago had told them the Iron Horse was hungry, and the soldiers were its teeth. "They are leaving," Tahan said, his voice heavy. "They will scatter into the mountains where the water is scarce." "We have to stop them," Cora said, gripping the edge of the seat. She touched the turquoise pendant at her throat. "We have to show them they do not have to run this time." They drove down the incline. The arrival of a wagon caused a ripple of alarm through the camp. Warriors grabbed their rifles and bows, forming a protective line. When they saw Tahan, the tension eased slightly. But then they saw Cora, a white woman sitting beside him, and the hostility returned, sharp as a knife edge. Tahan halted the wagon and stepped down. He spoke in his tongue, his voice commanding yet respectful. He gestured to Cora, not as a prisoner, but as a companion. A murmur went through the crowd. An old woman, her hair the color of wood ash and her face a map of 1,000 winters, stepped forward. She leaned on a twisted staff of juniper wood. This was Guyen, the keeper of stories. She looked at Tahan with eyes that were milky with cataracts, but saw clearly enough. Then she turned her gaze to Cora. She spat on the ground near Cora's boot. "Why do you bring the ghost skin here?" Guyen asked in English, her voice rasping like dry leaves. "She brings the soldiers. She brings the truth," Tahan said. "She saved my life, grandmother, and she carries a mark, you know." Tahan looked at Cora and nodded. Cora stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She unclasped the heavy silver pendant and held it out. The old woman squinted. She reached out a gnarled hand, her fingers hovering over the blue stone with the bird etching. The silence in the camp was absolute. "Laughing River," Guyen whispered. The hostility drained from her face, replaced by a profound, sorrowful recognition. "This is the stone of the woman who walked between the fires." "I am her daughter," Cora said softly. Guyen looked up at Cora's face, searching for her features. Yes, the eyes are the same. The spirit is the same. The old woman turned to the band. "Years ago, before Tahan's wife passed to the other side, she had a dream. She said that the circle was broken by greed, but it would be mended by a daughter of two worlds, a woman who speaks the language of the stone and the language of the paper." She reached into the folds of her deerskin dress and pulled out a small leather pouch, worn smooth by time and decorated with intricate beadwork. It was a medicine bundle. "Take it," Guyen commanded, pressing it into Cora's hand. "It contains the earth of this valley and the sage of the high mountains. It says, you are not a stranger. It says, you are home." Cora closed her fingers around the pouch. It felt warm, vibrating with a quiet energy. She looked at Tahan. He was watching her with a look of intense pride. The barrier between her and the people of the valley had dissolved. She was no longer a white intruder. She was the fulfillment of a promise. But the moment of peace was shattered by a sound that tore through the canyon air, the rhythmic, metallic ringing of a sledgehammer striking iron. They rode to the mouth of the valley, where the desert floor widened. The scene before them was an invasion. A work crew of 50 men was driving stakes into the ground, marking the path of the railroad. Tents had been erected in neat, military rows. A large map was pinned to a board, showing a black line slashing directly through the sacred springs. Briggs Dalton stood in the center of the activity, looking like a king surveying his new kingdom. Beside him stood Lieutenant Evans, looking pale and conflicted, and a new figure, a man with the silver eagle of a colonel on his shoulder straps. This was Colonel Mackenzie, a man known throughout the territory for his hardness, but also for a rigid, uncompromising code of honor. "Keep driving them," Dalton shouted to the workers. "I want the perimeter marked by noon. Stop!" The shout came from Cora. She stood up in the wagon as Tahan drove it straight toward the group of officers. The workers paused, hammers midair. Soldiers raised their rifles, but Colonel Mackenzie raised a gloved hand to hold their fire. Tahan pulled the horses to a halt 10 yards from Dalton. He sat tall, his rifle in its scabbard, his hands empty but his presence threatening enough. Cora stood beside him, dusty, disheveled, but radiating a fierce dignity. "Well, well," Dalton sneered. Stepping forward, "The traitor returns, and he brought his harlot with him." "Watch your tongue," Tahan said, his voice low and dangerous. "Colonel," Dalton said, turning to the senior officer, "this is the scout I told you about, the one who signaled the attack on our wagon train. And this woman, she is a captive, likely driven mad by her ordeal. Arrest him, shoot him if he moves." "No one is shooting anyone," Colonel Mackenzie said, his voice like gravel. He looked at Tahan, then at Cora. "You have a lot of courage riding back into the guns. Son, speak your piece." Cora climbed down from the wagon. Her legs shook, but she forced them to hold her weight. She walked until she was face to face with the colonel, ignoring Dalton entirely. "My name is Cora Lane," she said clearly, "and everything this man has told you is a lie." "She is hysterical," Dalton interrupted, moving to block her. "The heat has turned her mind. I am perfectly sane. Mr. Dalton," Cora snapped, turning her eyes on him with a withering glare. "Saner than you were the night you ordered your men to dress in buckskins and attack your own wagon train." A ripple of shock went through the soldiers. Lieutenant Evans looked up sharply. "That is a grave accusation. Miss Lane." Colonel Mackenzie said. "I saw them," Cora said, her voice ringing out across the clearing. "I saw the attackers. They rode army horses. They wore cavalry jackets under their costumes, and they smelled of the same cheap whiskey that Mr. Dalton's guards were drinking that very evening." "Lies," Dalton roared. "She is protecting her lover. Look at her. She has been living in the dirt with this savage." "I am protecting the truth." Cora reached into her pocket and pulled out the small notebook where she had copied the details from the ledger in Las Piedras. "And I know why you did it, to create a panic, to get the army to clear this valley so you could claim it." She opened the notebook. "I went to the land office in Las Piedras. I saw the ledger. Briggs Dalton claims he bought this land from Hector Villalobos and Antonio Perez." She looked at the lieutenant. "Lieutenant Evans, you served in this region last year, did you not?" "I did, ma'am," Evans stammered. "Do you know Hector Villalobos?" I did," Evans said, his face paling. "He was a scout. He died of smallpox last winter, in January." Cora turned the notebook toward the colonel. "The deed of sale is dated September the 4th of this year. Unless Mr. Dalton has found a way to do business with the dead, these contracts are forgeries." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a man. Colonel Mackenzie took the notebook. He read the entries, his brow furrowing. He looked at the date. He looked at Dalton. "Colonel, this is absurd," Dalton said, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. "Are you going to take the word of a runaway girl over a representative of the Southern Pacific Railroad?" "I take the word of the evidence," Mackenzie said coldly. "He wants the water," Cora pressed, gesturing to the springs behind them. "He does not care about the railroad or safety. He wants to own the only water for 50 miles so he can bleed every settler and every traveler dry." She held up the medicine bundle and the turquoise pendant. "This land belongs to the people who have guarded it for generations. My mother was one of them. She was a healer who lived with this band. They are not enemies, Colonel. They are families, and they are standing on the ridges right now, watching us." Everyone looked up. On the red cliffs overlooking the valley, the Apache warriors had appeared. They stood silent, bows in hand, silhouetted against the sun. They did not attack. They simply stood witness. "You see," Dalton shouted, seizing the moment of fear. "They are surrounding us. It is an ambush. Fire! Damn you! Defend your lives!" "Stand down," Colonel Mackenzie roared. But the panic Dalton had cultivated was a volatile thing. One of Dalton's hired guns, Silas, the man with the missing tooth, panicked, or perhaps he was following a final, desperate order. He raised his Winchester and aimed not at the warriors on the ridge, but at the woman who was destroying his master's empire. "Die, you witch!" Silas screamed. The crack of the rifle was deafening. Cora froze. She saw the muzzle flash. She expected the impact, but she did not feel it. A blur of motion slammed into her. Tahan had moved before the trigger was pulled. He threw his body between Cora and the gunman, shielding her completely. The bullet struck him. Tahan grunted, a sharp exhalation of air, and jerked backward, the impact spinning him around. He fell to one knee, clutching his left side. Blood, bright and shocking, began to seep through his fingers. "Tahan!" Cora screamed. She dropped to her knees, her hands covering his. "Hold fire!" Colonel Mackenzie bellowed, drawing his own revolver. He leveled it at Silas. "Drop it, or I will blow you to hell." Silas dropped the rifle, his hands trembling. The soldiers, disciplined men who respected bravery above all else, turned their weapons on Dalton and his men. Cora tore the hem of her petticoat. her hands shaking as she pressed the cloth against Tahan's side. "Look at me," she demanded, tears streaming down her face. "Do not you dare close your eyes." Tahan gritted his teeth, his face gray with pain, but his eyes were clear. "It is a scratch," he wheezed. "Through the muscle, missed the bone." "You foolish, reckless man!" Cora sobbed, pressing harder. "You took a bullet. I told you," Tahan whispered, reaching up to touch her cheek with a bloody hand. "A bridge has to bear the weight." Colonel Mackenzie walked over. Looking down at the scene, he saw the white woman tending to the Apache warrior. He saw the forged notebook lying in the dust. And he saw Briggs Dalton, who was now trying to sneak toward his horse. "Lieutenant Evans," Mackenzie said, his voice dangerously calm. "Place, mister. Dalton and his associate under arrest. Charge them with fraud, inciting a riot, and attempted murder." "Yes, sir," Evans said, with more enthusiasm than he had shown in months. Dalton struggled as the soldiers grabbed him. "You cannot do this. I have friends in Washington. This land is mine." "This land," Mackenzie said, looking at the springs and the silent warriors on the cliffs, "is under the protection of the United States Army until a federal judge says otherwise. And I suspect that the judge will be very interested in why you are buying land from dead men." He turned to his medical officer. "Doctor, get over here. This man needs attention." Cora slumped, her forehead resting against Tahan's chest. She felt the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath the wound. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving her exhausted but light. Tahan looked past her, up to the ridge. He raised his hand in a slow signal. On the cliff, the Apache warriors lowered their bows. They did not cheer. They did not descend. They simply acknowledged the act. Justice, or something close to it, had been served. "It is over," Cora whispered. Tahan looked at the colonel, then at the bound form of Briggs Dalton being dragged away. "No," Tahan said softly. "The war for the land never ends. Cora, but this battle, this one we won." He winced as the doctor began to examine the wound, but he did not cry out. He only kept his eyes on Cora, anchoring her to the earth, just as she had anchored him to the truth. In the middle of the valley of Coyote Springs, amidst the dust and the shouting soldiers, they had forged a new reality, one where the bullet did not have the final word. The dust of the confrontation had settled, but the air in Coyote Springs remained thick with a different kind of tension. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of bureaucracy colliding with ancient tradition. 3 days after the arrest of Briggs Dalton, a long table made of rough-hewn planks was set up beneath the shade of the largest cottonwood tree near the springs. It was a neutral ground, carefully chosen by Colonel Mackenzie to stand between the rigid lines of the army tents and the organic scatter of the Apache wickiups on the ridge. On one side sat the colonel and a weary-looking man named Mr. Sterling, the chief engineer for the Southern Pacific, who had arrived on the morning stagecoach to salvage the project. On the other side sat Tahan's uncle, an elder named Grey Wolf, and 2 other headmen of the band. They wore no war paint, but their faces were set in lines of stone. Between them sat Cora Lane. She wore a fresh dress borrowed from a settler woman, a simple calico that was slightly too large, but she sat with a posture that made the fabric seem like royal raiment. She was no longer the runaway bride or the terrified girl in the wagon. She was the voice. "Tell them, mister," Sterling said, wiping sweat from his bald head with a silk handkerchief, "that the rerouting of the line will cost the company $40,000. We have to blast through solid granite to the south. Tell them it is unreasonable." Cora turned to Grey Wolf. She did not translate the engineer's words literally. She knew that talking of dollars and blasting powder would only sound like threats. "The Iron Horse makers say the path to the south is hard," Cora said in the Apache dialect she had been practicing with Tahan during the long hours of his recovery, stumbling slightly but keeping her voice steady. "They say the stone there does not want to break. They ask why they cannot walk near the water." Grey Wolf looked at her, then at the engineer. "Tell the metalmen that the water is the blood of the valley. If they cover it with iron and smoke, the land will die. If the land dies, the people die. Ask him what the price of his mother's blood is." Cora turned back to Sterling. He says that the springs are essential for the survival of everyone in this region. Mr. Sterling, not just the Apache, but the settlers you hope to bring here. If you pollute the source with coal ash and runoff, you are poisoning your own investment. He asks if $40,000 is more expensive than a town that has no water. Sterling blinked. He looked at the crystal-clear water bubbling up from the earth a few yards away. He was a man of numbers. And Cora had just turned a spiritual argument into an economic liability. He has a point regarding the water table, Sterling muttered, scribbling in his notebook. If we contaminate the aquifer, the land lots will be worthless. Precisely, Cora said. And consider the cost of security. Sir, Mr. Dalton tried to secure this land with lies and hired guns. You saw the result. A war will cost you more than dynamite, but if you respect the springs, the Apache have agreed to allow passage through the southern pass. They will not attack the trains. They will trade. Colonel Mackenzie watched Cora with a shrewd, approving eye. He leaned forward, his chair creaking. It seems, Mr. Sterling, that Miss Lane is offering you the bargain of the century. Peace is a rare commodity in this territory. The negotiations dragged on for hours. Cora felt the strain in her throat and the ache in her back. She was weaving a tapestry out of two threads that had never wanted to touch. She spoke of property rights to the white men, using words like easement and stewardship. She spoke of survival and adaptation to the Apache, using metaphors of the changing seasons and the unstoppable river. She used her own life as the anchor. When Sterling questioned if the Apache could be trusted to keep their word, Cora spoke of Tahan. I was taught that these people were savages. Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice ringing clear in the afternoon heat. I was taught that I, as a woman, needed a man to own me and protect me. I was wrong on both counts. The man you call a savage took a bullet for me. The man who claimed to be my protector tried to kill me. Do not judge honor by the color of the skin or the cut of the coat. Judge it by the action. By sunset, a grim satisfaction had settled over the table. Hands were shaken awkwardly, but firmly. The railroad would move south. The springs would remain open, while the ink was drying on the preliminary maps. The truth about Briggs Dalton was being laid bare in the colonel's command tent. Lieutenant Evans had spent 2 days going through the satchels found in Dalton's quarters. What he found was not just corruption. It was a systematic predation that sickened even the hardened soldiers. He was playing both sides against the middle, Evans reported, placing a stack of ledgers on the colonel's desk. Look here, sir. He was charging the railroad company for security levies to pay off the local tribes. He claimed he was paying the Apache to not attack. And was he? Mackenzie asked, lighting a cigar. No, sir. He was pocketing the money. And when the railroad started asking why the threats remained, he hired his own men Silas and the others to stage the raids. He burned 3 homesteads last month just to justify a request for more funding. Cora, who had been asked to attend the briefing, felt a cold chill. He was not building a future, she whispered. He was afraid of farming. He is a parasite, Mackenzie growled. A man who wraps himself in the flag to steal from the widow and the orphan. He will not see the outside of a federal prison for 20 years. The news of Dalton's deceit spread through the settler camp like wildfire. The mood shifted. The anger that had been directed at Tahan and Cora transformed into a confused, sheepish gratitude. That evening, as Cora walked through the camp to fetch hot water, she expected the usual cold shoulders. Instead, a Mexican woman named Maria, whose husband had been swindled by Dalton, stopped her. "Señorita," Maria said, holding out a basket of fresh tortillas. "For you? And for the tall one?" Cora hesitated, then took the basket. "Thank you, Maria." "You stopped the devil," Maria said, crossing herself. "The water is safe. That is what matters. Vaya con Dios." Cora walked on, her heart full. It was a small thing, a basket of bread, but it was the first sprout of something new. This was not yet a town, and it was certainly not a paradise. But for the first time, the white settlers, the Mexican families, And the Apache scouts were looking at the same water source not as a prize to be fought over, but as a lifeblood to be shared. Tahan lay on a cot in a small, commandeered supply wagon that had been turned into a sick bay. The doctor had removed the bullet and stitched the muscle, pronouncing him lucky to be alive. Cora entered quietly, the basket of tortillas on her hip. The lamp cast a warm, golden glow over the small space. Tahan was awake, propped up against a saddlebag, polishing his knife with a piece of oilcloth. He looked up as she entered, and the hardness in his face melted away instantly. "You speak well," he said. "I heard your voice from here. You sound like a chief." "I sound like a tired schoolteacher who talks too much," Cora replied, setting the basket down and pulling a stool to his bedside. She reached out and touched his forehead, checking for fever. His skin was cool and dry. "The fever has passed," she noted. "The wound is nothing." Tahan dismissed, though he winced slightly as he shifted. "It is the sitting still that kills me." He looked at her hand resting on his arm. His skin was dark against hers, scarred and calloused. "The colonel offered me a job," he said quietly. Cora stilled. "What kind of job?" "He needs a liaison, someone to oversee the southern pass, someone to make sure the railroad workers stay on their line and the young braves do not get too close to the whiskey barrels. He calls it a provost marshal for indigenous affairs." "That sounds official," Cora said. "It sounds like a man who stands in the middle," Tahan said, his eyes searching hers. "I am done fighting. Cora, I have spent my life shooting arrows and bullets. I look at the valley now, and I see what you did today. You fought with words. You fought with the truth. That is the weapon of the future. So you will take it." "I am thinking about it," he said. "But a man in the middle is a lonely man. He belongs to neither side." Cora felt the question hanging in the air. It was the same question she had been asking herself. The doctor had mentioned that the town of Santa Fe was looking for teachers, a respectable job, a safe life. She could take the stagecoach tomorrow and be back in civilization in 3 days. No one would know about the nights in the wagon or the reckless devotion she had found in the desert. But the thought of the classroom, with its 4 walls and its chalk dust, felt like a prison. "You are not alone in the middle, Tahan," Cora whispered. "Not if there is someone standing there with you." Tahan reached out and took her hand. His grip was strong, anchoring. "And what of you, Sidi? Will you go back to the world of silk and tea?" "I think," Cora said, leaning forward, "that I prefer the taste of sage and dust, and I have found that silk tears too easily in a storm." 3 nights later, Tahan was well enough to walk. They left the noise of the camp and made their way down to the edge of the springs. The moon was a sliver of silver, and the sky was a tapestry of diamonds flung across black velvet. The air was cool and filled with the sound of water lapping against the stones. They sat on a flat rock, their shoulders touching. There was no desperate urgency tonight, no storm driving them together. There was only peace. "Look," Tahan said, pointing upward. "You call that the North Star?" "Yes," Cora said. "Polaris, the guiding light. We call it the one who stands still." Tahan said, "Because all the other stars dance around him, but he does not move. He is the anchor." He traced a line in the air. "And those 3, you call them Orion's belt?" "Yes. We call them the 3 runners. They are chasing the stag across the sky. They never catch him, but they never stop running. It is the running that makes them strong." Cora looked at his profile in the starlight, the sharp angles, the scar, the quiet strength. He was her one who stands still. He had been the anchor when her world had fallen apart. "I do not want to run anymore, Tahan," she said softly. Tahan turned to her. He took her face in his hands. "Then do not run." He kissed her. It was a kiss of profound tenderness. It was slow, tasting of the cool night air and the promise of tomorrow. It was a claim, not of ownership, but of partnership. "I love you," Cora whispered against his lips. It was the first time she had said the words aloud. They felt dangerous and right. "I am yours," Tahan replied. the Apache idiom for devotion. My breath is your breath. He pulled her into his arms, and she rested her head on his shoulder. Listening to the water, the wagon had rocked with passion, but the earth beneath them now felt solid. This was not a fling born of danger. This was the foundation of a house they would build together, stone by stone. The following morning, the treaty was ready. It was not a treaty between nations, but a legal agreement regarding the status of the Coyote Springs Valley. Colonel Mackenzie had drafted it with the help of the railroad lawyers, but the terms were dictated by the compromise Cora had brokered. The document lay on the table. It designated the springs and the surrounding 50 acres as a public commons, a protected zone where no fences could be built and water could not be sold. It guaranteed access to the Apache band for their seasonal ceremonies and to the settlers for their daily needs. Gray Wolf made his mark an X that looked like a bird in flight. Mr. Sterling signed with a flourish of his expensive pen. Colonel Mackenzie signed with a heavy, authoritative scrawl. We need a witness, the colonel said, looking around. Someone who represents the civilian interest. He held the pen out to Cora. Cora stepped forward. She looked at the paper. It was just paper, fragile and combustible. But it was also a shield. It was the proof that two worlds could exist in the same space without destroying each other. She took the pen. Her hand did not shake. She wrote her name, Cora Lane. She looked at the signature. It was the name of a schoolteacher from Missouri. But as she looked at it, she knew it was also the name of the bridge woman. She handed the pen back to the colonel. It is done, Mackenzie said. The land is secured. Tahan was standing at the edge of the crowd, leaning on a walking stick. He caught her eye and nodded. A slow, rare smile spread across his face. Cora walked toward him, the crowd parting to let her pass. She did not look down. She did not look back at the table or the soldiers. She looked only at him. It is done, she repeated when she reached him. No, Tahan said, taking her arm and turning her toward the open valley where the sun was rising over the red cliffs. It has just begun. The wind blew through the cottonwoods, rustling the leaves like applause. It carried the scent of water and the promise of a future that was neither white nor red, but something new, something forged in the fire and cooled in the spring. Cora Lane adjusted the turquoise pendant at her throat, took the hand of the warrior who walked beside her, and stepped forward into the morning. The wagon was gone, the storm had passed, and the road ahead was wide open. 5 years had passed since the bullet struck Tahan in the shoulder, and 5 years had passed since Colonel Mackenzie had driven the surveyors south. The valley of Coyote Springs had changed, yet in the most important ways. It had remained exactly the same. The cottonwood trees were taller now, their roots drinking deep from the protected aquifer. The red earth, once threatened by the iron rails and the smoke of locomotives, was now crisscrossed by the hoofprints of a different kind of traffic. They called the settlement Coyote Crossing. It was not a town in the traditional sense. There was no mayor, no sheriff with a tin star, and no jail. It was a cluster of adobe and timber buildings that had grown organically around the springs. There was a way station for the stagecoaches that passed through on the southern route, a blacksmith shop where the fire never seemed to die, and a long, low building that served as a schoolhouse during the day and a clinic by night. The railroad ran 5 miles to the south, a distant ribbon of steel that brought supplies and travelers but left the heart of the valley untouched. The train whistle could be heard on clear nights, a lonely, mournful sound that served as a reminder of the world that rushed by, leaving peace to those who knew how to stand still. Cora Lane stood at the door of the schoolhouse, wiping chalk dust from her hands. She is 27 years old now. The sun had deepened the lines around her eyes and turned her pale skin to a warm, golden tan. She wore her hair in a simple braid, woven with a strip of leather, a style that belonged to neither St. Louis nor the Apache, but to her, inside the room. The noise was a cheerful babble. 12 children were gathering their slates. 3 of them were the sons of white homesteaders. 4 were Mexican children from the families who worked the new orchards. and 5 were Apache, children from the band that still camped on the ridges during the harvest season. "Remember," Cora said, her voice carrying over the din, "tomorrow we will study the river. I want each of you to bring a stone from the water, and I want you to be able to tell me its name in English and in Apache." "Yes, Miss Cora," they chimed in unison, a chorus of accents that blended into the unique song of the crossing. As the children spilled out into the afternoon sunlight, Cora watched them go. They were the bridge she had promised to build. They played together, fought together, and learned together. They did not see the color of skin. They saw only who was fast at tag and who was generous with their lunch pail. A shadow fell across the doorway. Cora looked up, shielding her eyes against the glare. Tahan sat on his paint horse, watching her. He had changed too. The jagged scar on his shoulder was still there, hidden beneath a shirt of clean linen, but the hardness in his eyes had softened. He wore the buckskin leggings of his people, but on his head was a wide-brimmed felt hat, the kind favored by cattlemen. He carried a Winchester in a scabbard, but it was a tool now, not a limb. "The bridge woman is done with her lessons?" Tahan asked, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "The lessons never end." "Tahan," Cora replied, walking out to the porch. "But the school day is over. Did the convoy make it through the pass?" "They made it," Tahan said, dismounting with that fluid grace that still made Cora's breath catch. 6 wagons, merchants from the east. They were nervous about the canyon shadows, but I told them the only ghosts in these hills are the ones they bring with them." He walked up the steps, the wood creaking familiarly under his boots. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could smell the dust of the trail and the scent of pine. "They paid in silver," Tahan said, tapping his pocket. "And they left a crate of books for you. They said it was a toll for the safe passage." "You threatened them, didn't you?" Cora teased gently. "I merely suggested that a schoolteacher is more dangerous than a warrior if she is not kept supplied with reading material." Tahan replied solemnly. This was his new war. Tahan had become the most sought-after guide in the territory. He led the white men through the land without letting them destroy it. He taught the young Apache men how to read the survey maps and the legal contracts so they could never be swindled again. He was a man of 2 worlds, respected by the colonel at the fort and the elders in the mountains. "Any news from the wire?" Cora asked, her face growing serious. "A rider came from Santa Fe," Tahan said. "Briggs Dalton is dead." Cora went still. The name was a ghost from a past life, a shadow that had once threatened to swallow them whole. "How?" she asked. "A bar fight in Denver," Tahan said, his voice devoid of triumph or pity. "He was drunk. He accused a man of cheating on cards. He drew his gun, but he was too slow. They say he died owing money to everyone in the room." Cora looked out at the valley, green and vibrant in the afternoon light. She thought of the man who had worn fine suits and spoken of civilization while plotting murder. "He built nothing," Cora whispered. "He left nothing. He is the wind that passes." Tahan agreed. "He is gone, but the land remains." He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing the calluses on her palm. "Come, the stew is on the fire, and the day is long enough." However, peace was a garden that required constant weeding. Later that evening, the stagecoach from El Paso pulled into the station. The passengers were mostly tired travelers looking for a meal and a bed. But among them were 3 young men, drovers heading north to the cattle markets. They were loud, smelling of cheap whiskey, and carrying the arrogance of men who had never been tested. They stumbled into the dining room of the station, where Tahan was sitting with Cora and an old Mexican rancher named Don Miguel, one of the drovers, a boy of no more than 20 with a patchy beard, stopped when he saw Tahan. "Well, look at this," the boy sneered, nudging his companion. "They let Indians eat at the table here. I thought we were in America." The room went quiet. The other travelers lowered their forks, sensing the violence radiating from the young men. Tahan did not look up from his plate. He continued to cut his steak with deliberate precision. "Hey, Chief," the drover called out, emboldened by the silence. "I'm talking to you. The stables are out back. That is where the animals eat. Tahan set his knife down. The sound of metal hitting china was soft, but in the silence, it sounded like a hammer cocking. He stood up. He did not rush. He simply unfolded his height. Turning to face the boys, he said nothing. He just looked at them with eyes that had seen the worst of humanity and survived it. The drover faltered, his hand twitching toward the pistol at his hip. Now, don't you try anything. Sit down, boy. Cora's voice cut through the tension like a whip. She did not stand. She remained seated, sipping her coffee. She turned her head slowly to look at the drovers. This is not a saloon in El Paso, Cora said, her tone the one she used when a student was being particularly dense. This is Coyote Crossing. The food you smell was cooked by an Apache woman. The roof over your head was raised by Mexican hands. And the man you are insulting is the only reason you did not lose your scalps or your way in the canyon miles back. I ain't eating no Indian food, the drover muttered, though his confidence was crumbling under her steely gaze. Then you will go hungry, Cora said calmly, and you will sleep outside with the coyotes, because in this house, we break bread with respect. If you cannot afford that price, you can keep your money and your manners and leave. The boy looked at Tahan, who stood like a statue of bronze and iron. Then he looked at Cora, the white woman who looked at him with absolute, terrifying authority. He looked around the room. No one was on his side. The station master, the other passengers, even the old rancher they all watched with cold disapproval. The drover swallowed hard. He took his hand away from his gun. We will take a table in the corner, he mumbled. Ma'am. Tahan watched them sit, then slowly resumed his seat. He looked at Cora. The corner of his mouth twitched. You did not leave any fight for me, he murmured. You would have broken his jaw, Cora whispered back, pouring him more coffee. I only broke his pride. It heals faster, and he might learn something while it mends. Tahan shook his head, a mixture of amusement and awe in his eyes. Bridge woman, he said softly. You build the bridge, but you make them pay the toll. That night, after the station had quieted down and the moon had risen high above the cliffs, they walked back to their cabin. It was a sturdy structure of logs and stone, built on a rise overlooking the springs. On the door, hanging from a simple nail, was the medicine bundle Guyen had given Cora years ago. Beside it hung the silver turquoise pendant, gleaming in the moonlight. They were not locked away in a box. They were displayed as the crest of the house. Inside, the main room was warm and smelled of sage. On the large oak table in the center lay a map. It was not the grid-line chart of the railroad company. It was a hand-drawn map of the valley. The springs were not cut into square lots. Instead, a large circle was drawn around the water, and written in Cora's elegant script were the words, Coyote Springs Commons, for all who drink with respect. It was a legal document, recognized now by the territorial government, but it was also a prayer. Cora walked to the back door, which opened out onto a small porch, parked there, its wheels removed and its bed resting on stone blocks, was the old wagon. The same wagon they had huddled in during the storm. It had been turned into a bench, a place to sit and watch the stars. Tahan was already there, sitting on the weathered wood. He patted the space beside him. Cora sat down, leaning her head against his shoulder. The night air was cool, but his body was warm, a steady, radiating heat that she had come to rely on more than the sun. The stars are bright tonight, Tahan said, his arm coming around her waist to pull her close. The runners are resting, Cora murmured, looking up at Orion. And the one who stands still is watching. They sat in silence for a long time. The wind blew through the canyon, a gentle, sighing breeze that rocked the trees. Beneath them, the old wagon frame creaked slightly, a familiar groan of wood that brought a flood of memories. Cora remembered the terror of that first storm. She remembered the hail, the cold, and the desperate, reckless heat of their bodies tangling together as the world tried to tear them apart. She remembered the fear of being discovered, the fear of the bullet, the fear of the future. Now, The wagon rocked again, but it was a gentle motion. It was the rocking of a cradle or a porch swing. It was the rhythm of safety. "Do you remember?" Tahan asked, his voice vibrating against her ribcage. "The storm." "I remember every moment," Cora said. She turned her face into his neck, inhaling the scent of him. "I remember thinking I was lost." "You were never lost," Tahan said softly, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "You were just finding your way to the center." He turned her face toward his. The passion that had exploded between them in the storm had not faded, but it had changed. It had deepened. It was no longer a frantic fire that consumed. It was a bed of coals that burned steady and hot, capable of lasting through the longest winter. "We made it, Tahan," she whispered. "We really made it." "We did not just make it, Cora," Tahan said, leaning his forehead against hers. "We made this." He gestured to the dark valley, to the sleeping schoolhouse, to the quiet springs where Apache and white men drank from the same source. "Freedom," he said, the word heavy with meaning. "I used to think freedom had no walls, no ties, just the wind and the horse." "And now?" Cora asked. "Now I know," Tahan said, brushing his lips against hers. "Freedom is choosing the rope that binds you. I chose you. I chose this valley. And that is the only freedom that matters." He kissed her then. It was a kiss that held the memory of the storm and the promise of peace. It was slow. It was deep. It was inside the heart, inside the land, inside the life they had carved out of the impossible. The wagon creaked softly in the wind, rocking them gently in the darkness. They were two outcasts who had become the center of a new world. They held each other with a reckless devotion that had become a sacred trust, watching the stars wheel overhead, content to let the world spin while they stood still, together. Thank you so much for listening to this story of Cora and Tahan. Writing this journey of the Wild West has been an incredible adventure. I hope you felt the dust, the danger, and the love as much as I did. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from and what you thought of the ending. Did Tahan and Cora find the peace they deserved? If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to the channel Wild West Tales so you never miss a new adventure. Hit that like button to help us grow. If you really want to support these stories, please press the hype button to help this video get discovered by more listeners around the world. Until the next campfire, ride safe.